Oh my goodness, that video all by itself makes me feel like I've been to church. Whew. So it is Mother's Day, a complicated and somewhat emotionally fraught holiday, and the opening reading that Ed found for us captured that complexity so well. Thank you, Ed. And despite all that baggage that goes with Mother's Day, I have decided to use this holiday as a taking off point for reflecting on trust. Because trust is the very first thing we humans learn. We begin to learn it in our parents' or caregivers' arms. According to the humanist psychologist Erik Erikson, at least, he posited that we develop a sense of trust in infancy when our inarticulate cries get a response, when our basic physical and emotional needs are reliably and consistently met, when we are cared for and comforted. The infant learns to feel secure in a relatively secure situation so that the growing child can develop the capacity to feel secure in less secure situations. The trust we develop in infancy based on our relationship with our parents and caregivers becomes the basis for our ability to form trusting and trustworthy relationships outside that small circle. All our future human relationships are formed based on the worldview we develop long before we can even articulate it. If we experience a mostly reliable childhood, we can be hopeful after we emerge from the cocoon of childhood. We can learn to trust the world despite the inevitable disappointments and discouragements. But what if we don't learn trust in infancy? Is there a grim determinism about this that means we will always be wary and perhaps hopeless? Well, the good news is that we can change our worldview. We can learn new ways of being in the world despite what we have learned in infancy. A recent opinion piece in the New York Times by Olga Kazam offered this good news about how we can learn from our pandemic experiences. I quote, "The person who emerges from quarantine doesn't have to be the same old you. Scientists say that people can change their personalities well into adulthood. And what better time for transformation than now, when no one has seen you for a year and might have forgotten what you were like in the first place?" Do you want to change a personality trait? How about the trait of an entire congregation? Well, now's the time. As Richard Wiseman, a psychology professor at the University of Hertfordshire, put it in the as-if principle, you can behave as if you are the person you want to be. Pretty soon you might find that it is you. One of the things I loved about the video we just saw, which I assume was meant to be sort of a 12-step meeting, is that one of the things they always say in 12-step groups is fake it until you make it. And that's what we're talking about here. Act as if, and it may become the thing. Act as if you are the person you want to be. And I would further assert that a group can make the same choice. You can take advantage of this time of emergence and transformation and act as if you are the people together that you aspire to be. So where do we start? How about choosing to be a people of trust, as the Soul Matters theme from a couple of years ago urged us to do? The first step in that process is for each of us to make a choice about our own behaviors. We choose to be trustworthy. That choice is a form of spiritual practice, a complex practice that requires regularity and intentionality. And of course, to be a people of trust also means to practice trusting regularly and intentionally. And here's where it gets even more complex, because to be a person of trust does not mean automatically trusting everybody all the time. That would be naive at best and dangerous in some situations. We need to trust our gut about people and situations that represent genuine danger to us. In addition, we need to acknowledge that some of us are, by virtue of gender or ethnicity, for example, more vulnerable to aggression and microaggression than others. Those of us who have lived our lives in the cocoon of white privilege need to honor the experiences of people of color when they tell us that automatically assuming good intentions can be a dangerous and sometimes fatal mistake. So we practice being trustworthy, and we practice trusting our guts and honoring the instincts of others, and we practice trusting the people around us. We particularly need to cultivate a regular practice of trusting the people who choose to be in beloved community with us. And now I'm moving from talking about trust as a personality characteristic to talking about trust as one of the essential qualities of intentional community. And to do that, I want to draw a little bit on the work of the UU theologian James Luther Adams, whose life work was to study what he called the voluntary association. One of his core ideas was that people who are free to choose their groups and direct the nature of those groups tend to thrive. Adams approached this study of voluntary association with the awareness of two consistent threats to human freedom in association: radical individualism on one hand, and an authoritarianism, I guess we could call it, on the other hand. He saw voluntary association as the structure that mediates between these two tendencies. People involved in intentional communities are unlikely to fall victim to the isolation of excessive individualism. And intentional communities made up of people who freely choose their associations are unlikely to fall victim to the idolatry of authoritarianism. So how important is that right now in our nation? A major principle of religious liberalism, Adams wrote, is that all relations between people ought ideally to rest on mutual free consent and not coercion. It's such a simple concept, it almost goes without saying. In fact, most of us take it for granted most of the time, not only because we are Unitarian Universalists, people who habitually exercise our right of conscience in religious affairs, but also because we live in a nation whose founding principles embrace that same right of conscience, at least in their ideal form. So this philosophy of mutual free consent that was embodied in the free churches of our day actually started during the Radical Reformation. Those folks back then believed, in Adams' words, that God works in history where free consensus appears under the great taskmaster's eye. In other words, human beings are created to be free and to work out their freedom in groups. Those churches back then were established by our religious ancestors, the Anabaptists and others, who insisted that one's religion should be freely chosen at the age of reason. Back then, that was a very radical idea. Proponents lost their lives in its service, burned at the stake as heretics, or drowned in the rivers in a cruel parody of their radical church's radical practice of adult rather than infant baptism. We are the inheritors of their courage and their conviction. You might say that they entrusted us with the gift of religious freedom in voluntary association. So to be a people of trust is to create and nurture and sustain those associations in ways that are worthy of that gift. People suffered in an earlier age so that today we can exercise that right to join in voluntary association. Physical torture broke their bodies, but neither prison nor banishment nor even death could break their spirit and the spirit of that principle of free association that lives on. And you know what? Every time you show up at UUC, you redeem the lives of those who sacrifice themselves on the altar of freedom. Like every gift given to us, the claim this one lays on us is an obligation to exercise it regularly and gratefully. Don't take for granted this privilege of choosing the experience of your worship life. Don't take for granted this privilege of associating freely with these people who share worship with you this morning. This beloved community known as the Unitarian Universalists of Clearwater is far too precious to neglect or worse yet, to undermine in ways that threaten its very existence. Does that sound dire? Adams, in his study of voluntary association, reminded us with urgency of our obligation to select and put into action, quote, the right means and ends of cooperation for the fulfillment of human destiny. Let me repeat that phrase, the right means and ends of cooperation for the fulfillment of human destiny. That is what is at stake as you make choices about the nature of your relationships with each other in this congregation, the fulfillment of your human destiny together. We come together in voluntary association and form relationships based on mutual and free consent. And together, we work out the ways in which the inherent good in each of us can be actualized in all of us. And that requires the creation of a genuine covenant of right relations, a mutual agreement based on mutual respect and mutual trust. It is mutual trust, wrote H.L. Mencken, even more than mutual interest that holds human associations together. Mutual trust. In the aftermath of a conflict, when trust has been broken, it can be hard to be rebuilt. It can be scary to even think about trusting again. It is easier to do the familiar, to argue and undermine and hold on to grievances, but that just isn't working for you. The current culture of mistrust, which leads to the undermining of ministries and elected leaders, is simply not sustainable. So what is the next step in the process of rebuilding? Well, here is where the work of Richard Wiseman comes into play. If you are going to put your beloved community back together, you need to start acting as if you trust each other, and keep acting as if you trust each other until you remember what it feels like to trust and to be trusted. The cost to all of you of the culture of mistrust is just too high. For years and years, leadership in this congregation has paid the price of that mistrust. Clergy, staff, elected leaders, those who step up and answer the call to service, so many have been damaged by assumptions based on mistrust. And in fact, everybody is damaged by a culture of mistrust. No matter what side of a particular issue you may be on, everyone is damaged. Our spirits are damaged. And that's why I'm telling you, you have nothing to lose by acting as if you were a people of trust. Think of it as returning to that safe space you may or may not have experienced as infants. Set a goal for yourselves to achieve together that essential developmental milestone, learning to trust. As the Quaker theologian Parker Palmer said, if we are willing to embrace the challenge of becoming whole, we cannot embrace it alone, at least not for long. We need trustworthy relationships to sustain us, tenacious communities of support to sustain the journey toward an undivided life. Act as if you believe in yourselves and in each other. Return again and again to the work of creating and sustaining your beloved community, a community built on mutual trust, a tenacious community of support. Emerging from that social isolation of the pandemic into a new platform reality, emerging from a painful conflict into a time of rebuilding and recovenanting, emerging from trauma into healing. It sounds scary, doesn't it? And it sounds hard, and it is scary, and it is hard. But what have you got to lose? Nothing more and nothing less than the beloved community of faith that you call home, the Unitarian Universalists of Clearwater. This month of May, we are focusing on the development of trust as a spiritual practice. Check your e-octagram for opportunities for small group practice. You can also come back after lunch today at 1 o'clock for a sermon discussion when I will ask you the question, what would it look like, feel like to act as if you were a people of trust? I want to conclude this sermon with what I think is a powerful image of mistrust from Alia Tidorenko. Wrote, I imagine trust as those invisible hands that we stretch out into the world, looking for someone to hold on to us as we walk into the unknown future. As the pandemic ends and we enter the new phase of our life together in community, that's the unknown future. Let us know that there will be hands to hold on to as we embrace that future together. Let it be so.